samurai swords, silent paper walls, a government ruled not by emperors but by shadows behind the throne. Yet beyond the honor and the armor lies a slower tale of rice taxes, dusty roads, and curfews at sundown. This is the real rhythm of the Japanese shogunate, and it's surprisingly sleepy. Lay back like a court servant after dusk and drift through centuries of warlords, tea houses, and midnight curfews. Press play, relax your mind, and let this quiet march through Shogunate. History lull you into peaceful slumber. Subscribe for more bedtime journeys into boring, beautiful history. You begin in the margins of polite society where the real work is done with quiet hands. Imagine a coastal town at the edge of the old capital's authority, not yet called Kamakura's stronghold, but already thick with men who have more calluses than court ranks. The language of rule here is not poetry, but contracts, not incense, but ledgers. You can almost feel the shift in the air when you notice that the things that matter are no longer who recited a waka at a spring banquet in Heian-kyo, but which household has horses that can move at dawn, which steward knows how to keep the harvest safe from bandits, and whose oath, sealed by a thumb-stained strip of paper, will actually be kept. You are watching a slow pivot in Japanese history, from court to camp, from elegant shadow to practical daylight, and it is not a single declaration that makes it happen, but a stack of small, boring decisions repeated across farms and footpaths, until the new pattern holds. In these years, the land is divided not only by mountains and rivers, but by rights and exemptions. Vast private estates, called shuan, cut across the landscape like islands of privilege, tied to aristocratic families, temples, and shrines that have charters exempting them from some taxes and supervision. On these estates, cultivation does not occur in abstraction. It is measured and noted field by field, with cadastral surveys and wooden markers sunk into the soil to show boundaries. Farmers count their yields not in coins but in koku, the measure of rice sufficient to feed one person for a year, though in practice they handle smaller units measured in square wooden boxes, passed hand to hand and recorded by stewards with care. The authority that matters to a farmer sweating under the summer sun is not the minister in the capital, but the local official who decides how much rice stays in the village and how much must travel in sacks over treacherous roads to a warehouse near the sea. When war comes, as it does during the long clash between rival warrior houses, the Taira and the Minamoto, it does not arrive with shining, simple lines. It arrives as disruption to that chain of custody between field and storehouse. Horses pass over embankments, conscripts leave furrows half-weeded, messengers arrive asking for contributions in rice and cloth to supply a force gathering in a nearby valley. To you, the listener, it does not sound like the dramas of literature. It sounds like someone asking where the extra sacks can be kept dry when the rain turns heavy, and whether the men can be spared from repairs to the floodgate. This is how power bends, little by little, to whoever can safeguard grain and pay men. It is in this environment that a figure like Minamoto no Yoritomo gains a foothold, not only because he leads warriors, but because he pledges to protect landholding rights, to confirm local stewards, and to make those dull promises stick. Picture a small office in a makeshift compound, paper walls and a low desk, and a clerk writing in a neat hand, while a line of men wait, each with a petition. One claims that his family has held the right to guard a bridge for 3 generations, another that he put down a bandit group last fall and deserves confirmation as local steward. Compensation, titles, and rights are not yet what you might expect. From a centralized state, they are concrete and bounded. When Minamoto authority consolidates, it does so through positions like Jito, the estate stewards responsible for managing fields, collecting rents and keeping order, and Shugo, the military, governors who oversee provinces and ensure that a levy can be raised. These terms are technical and their duties intricate. A Jito may receive a fixed portion of the estate's yield, often a percentage measured carefully, and the right to pursue justice in certain kinds of disputes. If you look closely, you see the power of the state resting in notebooks, in lists of who owes what to whom, in confirmations written and sealed, more than on the battlefield where sudden victory can be reversed in a season. The capital, so polished and poised, still matters. Titles such as Sei Taishogun, the great general appointed to subdue barbarians, are granted from the court in Heian-kyo, giving a veneer of legitimacy that countries across East Asia recognize. But that official appointment, when it comes, mostly ratifies what the countryside already knows, that the man in Kamakura can deliver stability. To understand the quiet revolution, you should look at the new offices established in Kamakura, one to handle military affairs and discipline among the warriors, another to administer households and finance, and a third to adjudicate disputes. These bodies sit like a practical triangle over the countryside, projecting order by turning quarrels into files. Men who once would have sought mediation from a senior retainer now file a suit that can be decided, recorded, and enforced. The key paper trail binds the sword. For a culture accustomed to negotiated relationships and personal intercession, this is revolutionary in its own restrained way. You can trace the origin of the bakufu, the tent government, first as a kind of metaphor, a hint that power is mobile, grounded in the commander's encampment instead of a palace. Yet there is nothing ephemeral about the institutional life that grows under this tent. The bakufu sends instructions out along roads guarded by minor posts. It collects oaths of allegiance from vassals across the Kanto plain and beyond. It fixes appointments that anchor men to specific places. The terrain matters here. East of the old capital, the Kanto offers wide horse pasture and a network of rivers that can be used to move goods by boat, cutting down the time from field to storehouse to coastal transport. A practical geography supports a practical government. You notice, as you trace all these modest details, that the change in Japan is not from peace to war or war to peace, but from one kind of administration to another. The new administration is built to work even when a distant court is preoccupied, with poetry and ceremonial calendars. Law enters this story not as a grand code splashed across bronze pillars, but as a set of precedents and working rules. Early on, there are decisions about inheritance, about who counts as a legitimate heir, about the obligation of vassals to appear when summoned, and about the punishment for failure. These determinations are recorded and circulated not to inspire, but to ensure that similar cases will be treated similarly. You, as a listener, can appreciate how this regularity reduces the friction in daily life. A minor landholder can plan for his sons. A widow can know what claims she may have to the late husband's household goods. The law is not an instrument of ideology so much as a tool of predictability. This is a boring glory, the kind that lets life feel breathable when the harvest is uncertain and the river floods are not always kind. Domestic order requires, above all, a reliable register of men and resources. Household roles and estate inventories are not romantic objects, but they make armies possible and taxation plausible. When a steward in a village updates the register after a marriage or death, he is also updating the state's understanding of how many able-bodied men can be called for a levy and how many mouths the granary must feed in a bad year. These records are checked and rechecked by inspectors who arrive with little ceremony. They may measure fields again, ask to see the tools, verify the claims about irrigation ditches. If they find discrepancies, fines follow. To you, this process may seem tedious, and that is precisely the point. A government that makes routine its core strength endures longer than one that thrives on spectacle. The men who bind this system together are not exclusively noble, they are capable. Their qualifications are less tied to genealogy and more to what they have proven in assignments that are not glamorous. Guarding a pass through the hills in winter, ensuring that bandits do not intimidate travelers carrying rice, gathering testimony in a landlord-tenant dispute about the distribution of manure to a particular field, these are tasks that indicate reliability. The culture of the warrior class evolves in this period to prize not only martial prowess, but steadiness. You can almost overhear advice whispered from father to son. Keep your word in small matters, present yourself promptly when called, bring horses properly fed, do not overreach when entrusted with another household's accounts. In these small disciplines, the bakufu finds its backbone. The presence of powerful women is a reality that often hides beneath the language of the records. Wives manage households while men answer summons. Mothers arrange marriages that strengthen bonds between lineages. Widows petition the administration when their rights are threatened. The quiet labor of women keeps fields tended, granaries in order, and temple obligations fulfilled. A letter written in a clear but unornamented hand can decide whether a child is recorded as heir or whether a parcel of land is transferred to a cousin to settle a debt. Their influence is administrative, intimate, and persistent. In a society that values continuity, those who mediate continuity have weight. Religious institutions are not apart from this. Temples and shrines own land, employ stewards, maintain storehouses, and adjudicate issues among their dependents. Ritual calendars intersect with agrarian cycles, but they also intersect with fiscal obligations. A festival is not only a day of music, but a deadline for payment. A memorial service is not just a prayer, but a moment when a monk may witness the transfer of rights from a deceased man to his heir. You can see how intertwined the sacred and the mundane become, not because of grand theological disagreements, but because those who can keep order in the soul are often well suited to keep order in the books. The bakufu recognizes this and often leaves temple estates intact, confirming their privileges in exchange for cooperation and stability. Communication in this world is an art of reliability. A folded paper with a seal must arrive intact. A messenger must leave at dusk to cross a river by moonlight. A horse must be switched at a relay station without fuss. Roads are not simply paths, they are arteries by which rule travels. Over time, the bakufu encourages the maintenance of specific routes, the placement of simple markers, and the discipline of those who use them. A suit filed in a provincial town can make its way to Kamakura within a predictable window. In that, predictability lies something like justice. If you have ever waited for news that would determine the course of your life, you understand how valuable it is to know roughly when the decision will arrive. When fighting does flare, as it must in a land where loyalties are layered and ambitions are never fully asleep, the machinery of administration absorbs the shock. A rebellious local magnate may be stripped of appointment, his steward replaced, his vassals offered confirmation if they switch sides. Punishment and reward are again administered through documents and seals, more often than through spectacular executions. The outcome of a battle matters less when power can recruit the surrendered into new loyalties. The long view is always present. You, sitting quietly with this history, can see that the genius of the early bakufu is not that it eliminates conflict, but that it derives rules for living with it. The practical economy of rice and cloth is matched by an economy of honor, which is also carefully measured. A vassal who answers quickly to a levy may receive a hunting falcon as a token or a fine sword. but he may also receive the far more valuable gift of a confirmed appointment as Jito over a prosperous estate. Honor is convertible into administration, and administration back into honor. The circle closes neatly. There is comfort in the predictability of this exchange. It makes men more willing to subordinate immediate desire to longer-term gain. The culture that arises around these exchanges is sober, inclined to value good sense over panache. Even the songs sung in victory camps carry a tone of restraint, celebrating duty fulfilled rather than daring stunts. For the ordinary people, farmers, artisans, ferrymen, the shift to a warrior-led administration is felt most sharply in the avenues of recourse. A farmer whose ox is stolen can, through his headman, bring a case to a steward who has clear authority to investigate and punish. A dispute about water rights during the dry season can be escalated with some confidence that a decision will be reached before the crops fail. The plague years and the years when typhoons flatten the coastal villages still come because nature does not negotiate, but the social machinery that helps people recover becomes sturdier. The distribution of seed rice from a storehouse may be controlled, the repayment terms fixed and recorded, the return of grain after the harvest verified by a third party. All this is dull procedure, but it means fewer families slide into ruin because of the whim of a local strongman. You are meant to see how the boring aspects of rule are often the most humane. Over time, you notice that Kamakura is not merely a headquarters, but a culture center of its own kind. It gathers craftsmen, scribes, armorers, and horse handlers. The market rhythms follow the levy cycles, with busy weeks before a campaign as leatherworkers deliver saddles and rope makers coil thick lines for ferries. A quiet prosperity takes root in these service industries. Families that once had slender prospects find that supplying the new order is steady work. In the evenings, the talk in sack houses is less about verse and more about the news of appointments or a rumor of audits in the neighboring province. The city breathes with purpose. It is not a glamorous purpose, but it gives ordinary life a frame. Political fragility hides under this competence, of course. A system tied to specific families and personal trust always risks fracture when succession is in question. The early shogunal household must manage marriages, adoptions, and the careful balancing of power among senior retainers. The regency that later grows up around the office is born of these concerns, a way to keep continuity when a child inherits or when factions threaten to split the core. Even here, the solution is administrative. Councils, routines for consultation, scheduled audiences. It is easy to underestimate how a regular meeting can keep a polity from breaking. The sound of the bell that signals the start of deliberations is dull, but many lives depend on its ring. In your mind's eye, take one more slow walk through a village under this new order. You pass a shrine where offerings of rice and salt sit neatly arranged. You pass a warehouse with its thick doors. You pass a field marked out with careful lines and a farmer stopping at the edge to check the irrigation gate. The headman's house has a chest with hanging locks and a shelf with rolled papers, some with black cords. Children know to keep away from that shelf. At the end of the road, a small guard post has a brazier burning at night and a board listing the duty schedule for the week, names written clearly so no one mistakes which household owes a man on which day. The sunlight on these objects makes plain a truth. State power resides as much in these quiet things as in banners on a battlefield. If you look for grand statements from this era to explain why the Bakufu triumphed, you will be disappointed. The reasons are in the steps taken to confirm appointments swiftly, to decide disputes consistently, to extract rice fairly enough that people cooperate, and to ensure the movement of orders and goods along specific, maintained paths. The world creaks toward a new normal, and soon it is easy to forget that it was ever otherwise. You, listening in the dark, can see these details click into place. Yet a question remains, smouldering at the edge of this stability, a question that could unmake it at any moment. When fortunes shift and extraordinary stress arrives from beyond the ordinary routines, perhaps in the form of a disaster no precedent quite covers, will this quiet architecture of rule hold its shape, or will the seams you cannot see by lamplight begin to split? You return to Kamakura, and this time the air feels denser, as though the quiet order of registers and seals has condensed into an atmosphere that everyone breathes. The tent government you watch take shape now wears the layered clothing of habit, as offices acquire rhythms and the men who hold them learn the relief of being busy. The Hojo family stands near the center, not with flamboyant claims, but with the unobtrusive insistence of daily presence, presiding over councils, sending out circulars, confirming old arrangements, and intervening just enough to keep an equilibrium that does not depend on any single dramatic act. What you notice most is how the Regency turns volatile loyalties into predictable duty. The word used is service, and it has a schedule, a list, a set of penalties, and a sense of purpose that, once felt, is hard to give up. It begins, as so many durable things do, with rules written for use, not display. A collection of judgments and working norms is set down to guide officials in deciding the disputes that never stop arriving. Who inherits what when brothers quarrel? How do you handle land sales made under duress? Which crimes require exemplary punishment and which can be settled through restitution? The text is concise, not rhetorical, and it emphasizes what will count as evidence, who must appear in person, and how to keep elections of village headmen from becoming farce. You can imagine a clerk reading aloud to a room of petitioners, explaining that testimony must come from those who actually saw the incident, that hearsay is insufficient, and that documents with broken seals may be challenged. The miracle here is not moral transformation, but a preference for procedures that can be replicated at the edge of the state without the presence of great men. Across the provinces, stewards and military governors begin to treat suits like seasonal crops. In one thick stack are inheritance matters, in another are disputes over water. The water cases grow in summer when streams shrink and fields panic. The inheritance cases grow in winter when men die and wills are tested. Inspectors from Kamakura make circuits to ensure that the local answers resemble the central guidance. These inspectors are not terrifying figures, they are craftsmen of consistency. They arrive with lists from previous years, compare new papers with old, and note whether the same seals appear again, or whether a suspiciously fresh string ties a document that claims to be old. In your ear is the soft rasp of a brush across paper, drawing the characters that will fix a boundary stone's meaning for decades. Oaths are everywhere. A vassal swears to appear when summoned, to support the regent's decisions, to report bandits, to abstain from harboring fugitives. A steward swears to collect and remit the correct portion of the harvest, neither squeezing nor indulging beyond the written rate. A village headman swears on behalf of his people that they will guard their section of road and present their able-bodied men for repairs and levies. The form of these oaths is simple, a vow before heaven, often with a shrine as witness, and the understanding that perjury brings both official punishment and spiritual risk. For you, the listener, the ubiquity of oaths signals that trust is not assumed. It is deliberately created, made legible, and bound to consequences that matter in a world that still thinks misfortune can follow from moral failure. Debt creeps along the edges of this order. Lean harvests, the need to supply a son with proper arms and a horse, the obligation to present oneself well at a summons. These expenses lead landholders to borrow against future yields. Lenders emerge, some in monasteries with plenty of grain to loan, others in towns where credit mixes with trade in cloth and oil. Documents multiply here too: promissory notes, pledges backed by land rights, and the sad little drafts that show a family selling a portion of its paddy for less than it is worth because they have no choice. The administration recognizes the problem and tries to rein it in, forbidding sales that would strip a warrior of the means to perform service, restricting predatory rates, and occasionally proclaiming remissions that cancel bad debts when crisis has spread too far. You notice, in these acts, a grim balance. Without credit, families sink when storms come. With too much credit, the foundation of military service erodes. While all this paperwork hums, the sea sends signals. Strange sails appear in western waters, and rumors carry not only the names of distant rulers, but the taste of salt and blood. The messages that reach Kamakura are polite at first, letters from beyond asking for acknowledgement, but beneath the courtesies is the flicker of a demand. The Regency responds with its own courtesies, pressing them into the forms it knows best: advisory councils, memoranda, plans. You see how hard-won routines meet a threat that is not routine. New offices are created along the western shore to coordinate watch and defense. Beacons are arranged, simple fires that must be tended by men who now add night shifts to their daytime labors. Supplies are cached in hills near the bays most likely to be approached by ships. The language of these preparations is as numb as, always, quantities, rotations, routes. But the mood sharpens. The question hovering in the last section returns with a new edge. Can paper systems stretch across water? In Kyushu, the administration tightens. A special commissioner, empowered to command local stewards, arrives with lists of allotted guard posts and detailed instructions about who must stand where along the defensive lines facing the sea. Stone and earth move under human hands. A long wall rises low but sturdy, interrupting the gentle slope of shore where invaders might have landed. This is not heroic architecture. It is practical geometry. Stones are sunk to stabilize the base. Gabions are filled with rubble and tamped. The lime that binds is mixed with care by men who are paid with rice and promises. The catalogue of who provided what materials is as important as the wall itself, because being able to claim that your household delivered the ropes or the planks can later be converted into favors. You learn, walking through this place, that every rock has a receipt. Armaments adapt modestly to the maritime context. Arrows are treated to resist damp, coils of rope are kept in dry sheds, small boats are inspected for seaworthiness. Ferrymen are informally drafted, their knowledge of currents turned into a map scribbled on paper or sometimes drawn in the sand during morning briefings. Horses that have carried men across fields now stand uncomfortably near salt water. The logistics of feeding animals on a coast where the land is narrow are solved with care. Hay is moved at night to avoid overheating. Troughs are placed under overhangs. Men assigned to watch the animals are rotated often to prevent inattention. These details will not make a song, but you feel how they make readiness. Even the rhythm of temple bells is adjusted so that the alarm is distinct from the call to prayer. In the capital, ceremonial calendars continue, but their relevance is filtered through Kamakura's demands. The Regency does not spurn court recognition, it uses it. Appointments are framed as fulfilling imperial will, and the old titles sit like lacquer on top of new realities. When men are honored for service on the Western Defense, the documents bear both seals, court and camp, and the recipients bow in both directions, satisfied that their status is secure across the cultural map. If you listen to their private conversation, you hear a kind of pragmatic piety, respect for old forms because they make new forms smoother. No one here thinks that poetry and ritual have vanished. They have been domesticated into the schedule. The first encounter with the seaborne threat is abrupt and damp. Boats come in under wind. Men in unfamiliar armor step onto muddy flats. Fighting is confused in the shallows where footing is treacherous. The defensive wall you watched rise does not stop everything, but it funnels and delays and allows small groups of defenders to hold longer than their numbers would suggest. Messages fly down the line as if pulled on a string. Reinforcements arrive not as a roaring charge, but as a series of sober detachments. Each group knows where to stand because the paper told them weeks ago. In the aftermath, scattered dead are counted and named, not because there is time for elaborate funerals, but because a family somewhere will need proof to claim a widow's portion or to confirm that a younger brother now inherits. The administration's tender heart beats inside these dull lists of casualties. Between attacks, something even more demanding than courage is required. Maintenance. The wall sags after heavy storms, ditches fill with sand, watch huts leak, logs rot faster near the water. Men who might have preferred to practice swordplay spend days moving earth with wicker baskets, rethatching roofs so that the rain runs off properly, and inventorying the oil left for lamps. The coastal villages learn to plan for interruptions in fishing, to repair nets while standing guard, to trade fish for rice with interior households that are now assigned to keep the coastal men supplied when sea work is impossible. The Regency mediates these ties with chit after chit, recording obligations in forms that will feel dull only to those who do not also feel their relief. When the second great attack comes, the experience of the first has congealed into procedure. The beacon system is triggered in an order that is almost beautiful to watch from a hilltop. A dot brightens, then another, then a many-pointed crown of service catches and goes to work. You, watching in your mind's eye, might expect the moment to be seized by a single, heroic figure, but the reality is a collective steadiness that resists drama. Boats that attempt to moor find pilings in the way. Attackers who scramble over walls drop onto well-swept ground where defenders do not trip over their own clutter. The springy patience of men who have drilled the movement of ladders and the passing of buckets becomes as decisive as any bold charge. Yet victory leaves behind a problem that no enemy could have delivered more neatly. The good order of administration requires rewards to match service. If new lands were taken, they could be given. If wealth poured in, it could be distributed. But defending the coast yields no conquered estate, only the absence of loss. Men who fought bravely return to their households and find the same fields, the same troubles, and in some cases heavier debts incurred during the long months at the wall. The Regency tries to compensate with commendations, with small stipend, from public storehouses with incense and solemn words. For a while, gratitude holds. Then slowly, arithmetic begins to bite. The signs are subtle at first. A steward delays payment on a loan, pleading that the harvest was short. A vassal asks permission to mortgage a portion of his right to an estate's yield, just until his son comes of age. A village headman slips when counting the conscripted days of labor assigned to his people, hoping to ease tension. As the thin ice of habit bears more weight than it was built for, it begins to crack in small lines. Banditry, once localized and manageable, grows bolder, sometimes prefaced with a claim that the victim deserved it for breaking custom or for collaborating with an unpopular steward. The administration responds with its old tools, circulars condemning lawlessness, new oaths reaffirmed with solemnity, and investigations that identify names and punish with fines, confiscations, and exile. But you can sense that the work of keeping promises in alignment with possibilities has become more delicate. Monasteries, those places of prayer and bookkeeping, are drawn deeper into the web. Some have lands that generate steady rice, others host markets that knit together the countryside with towns. Warriors turn to them for loans, villagers appeal to them for arbitration. Abbots learn to read not only sutras, but ledgers with a strategist's eye. In meeting halls fragrant with old smoke, disputes are settled with words that recall religious duty, while tallying the exact number of bundles to be delivered by sunset. You might be tempted to believe that piety alone calms tempers, but it is the credibility of the monastery as a place where agreements stick that makes it central. The Regency leans on this credibility, confirming temple privileges regularly, asking abbots to help dampen feuds, and occasionally stationing armed men at a gate to remind everyone of the limits of negotiation. Meanwhile, in Kamakura, councils multiply. What began as a triangle of basic offices becomes a mesh of committees with names that would put most listeners to sleep. There are meetings to schedule other meetings, lists of cases to be heard in the correct order, memoranda about memoranda. The point is not false complexity, but the recognition that problems ripple outward and must be caught before they become waves. You sit in on one such council in your mind and feel the seriousness that attends a discussion of apparently trivial matters, whether a particular road should have a new post station, whether the levy call for a given province should be in the autumn rather than the summer, how to account for families whose working-age men have been depleted by disease. The attendance is good. The habit of showing up is the quiet virtue of these years. In the residential compounds of the warrior class, daily life has survived the sea winds at a cost of adjustment. The youngest sons are not guaranteed generous shares. Marriages are arranged with an eye to consolidating right of use rather than expanding a family's spread too thinly. Women continue to manage estates while men are absent, and their authority becomes a buffer between expectation and disappointment. A competent woman can save a household by choosing when to sell a bit of silk to pay interest, when to press a case, and when to swallow a loss to secure goodwill. The stories told to children emphasize not only courage, but thrift. The boy leaps a stream. The girl balances the ledger. In this culture, poems about weeds in a neglected embankment or the sound of rain on a repaired roof carry moral weight. What, you may ask, of the old capital? It persists, elegant as ever, its rituals observed even when fewer people feel the old enchantment. Courtiers adjust to receiving warriors in mixed dress, the aristocratic cloak draped over armor, and they learn the art of flattery that does not make a man inured to field life roll his eyes. The court's ability to bestow titles continues to be useful, a kind of currency that spends differently in different places. When a warrior returns from the western defenses and is honored by the court, the community nods. It is not the honor that keeps the roof over his head, but it oils the social gears. The Regency ensures that no one can accuse it of disrespect for tradition, because disrespect would cost more in cooperation than it could ever save in efficiency. The countryside itself changes under the prolonged weight of defense. Fields near the coast are planted with hardy varieties of rice that tolerate salt better. Inland, a diversification of crops appears as families hedge against failed yields. Tools improve slowly. Iron edges are sharpened to a finer angle, hoes are balanced for longer use with less fatigue, and carts are repaired by men who have learned on the job, because a broken axle at the wrong time can unspool obligations disastrously. Roads, worn by levy marches and supply wagons, receive more consistent maintenance. A rank system for post stations evolves. Some are known for better stables, others for reliable food, and messengers learn the map of these qualities as intimately as they know the landmarks. Over years, the memory of the sea attacks calcifies into anniversaries. Shrine festivals include prayers for continued safety. Fishermen tie extra charms to their boats. Children are warned away from the deep at certain times of year. The Regency uses these rhythms to schedule inspections and to collect morale along with taxes. It is not incidental that this is also a time when stories about divine favor circulate. You notice that none of this requires the regency to claim mystical powers. It is content to collect the benefits of a population that feels protected by both heaven and the men of Kamakura. The fusion of practical defense with the reassurance of ritual is a joint between two kinds of certainty. But limits continue to nudge the edge of the map. The balance between service and compensation, between debt and endurance, becomes trickier as old estates fragment through inheritance and as population outpaces easy gains in productivity. Where once a confirmation of appointment as steward might have secured a family's fortunes for decades, now it must be renewed more often and defended more strenuously against challengers who can point to obscure clauses or old favors. The legal office grows a branch devoted simply to keeping track of precedents, and young men with sharp minds but little land find careers in interpreting what the old words now mean. A society that prizes continuity must also manage reinterpretation, and that gymnastics begins to wear on everyone involved. You, sitting with this story in a quiet room, can feel the dignified fatigue of a system that has done many things right. It has built procedures that carry through crisis. It has allowed ordinary people to lodge complaints and sometimes see them redressed. It has defended its shores without falling into chaos. It has made a virtue of boring labor. And yet, as the oaths multiply and the audits thicken, the question of how to replenish the reservoir of goodwill becomes more insistent. What do you do when a good administration cannot manufacture enough reward to match the constancy it requires? How long can a tapestry hold when the threads of service are pulled tighter each year and the loom itself begins to creak? You return to Kamakura and find that the smell of salt has settled into the paper. The wall along the western shore is quiet, its stones warmed by an indifferent sun. Men who once counted watch rotations now count installments on loans, and the most dangerous storm is not at sea but in the arithmetic that governs a household's future. You watch the system you have grown to admire doing what competent systems do when stretched beyond their design. It tries to adjust by refining rules and tightening lines by adding cautions to promises and pauses to obligations. There is no villain here and no single act of treachery to make the tale vivid. Instead, there is a slow drift of weight onto parts never meant to carry so much. You sit with it, feeling the tension rise in quiet rooms where nothing more dramatic than a widow's seal being pressed into a document takes place. The first symptom is an old one you have already seen: debt. The Regency had tolerated a kind of seasonal borrowing that let households bridge the gap between expense and harvest, especially during the years when the coast had to be held and men spent months away from their fields. Grain loans kept granaries busy and scribes employed, promissory notes travelled folded inside sleeves, and a reputation for fairness could save a family when rain failed. But when conflict ebbed, loans did not. The need to maintain horses, repair gear, arrange marriages that bound houses more tightly, all this continued while new lands to grant did not appear. Families sold portions of their right to estate yields, sliced thin at first, and then thicker until a man could not guarantee that he had the means to answer a levy without mortgaging tomorrow. You can picture a careful woman, the household's quiet mast, deciding which bolt of cloth to sell to satisfy interest without breaking the dignity that secures future favors. The administration recognized the danger and reached for a tool it had used in smaller ways: remission. Orders were issued cancelling certain classes of debts, undoing transfers made under duress, and restoring land rights to the original military households so they could continue to perform service. The words used were familiar: compassion, public order, the need to preserve the military class. The relief was real for some, especially those who had tangled themselves in short-term obligations to unscrupulous lenders. But remission itself had a cost. Credit requires trust that a note will be honored. Too much cancellation and the engine of seasonal borrowing stalls. Worse, remissions could not manufacture koku. The harvest was no bigger after a decree. The population kept growing. The rows of names in household registers did not shrink. Even as rice continued to pour into warehouses, its distribution felt tighter, the margins thinner, the forgiveness more fraught. In the provinces, the line between steward and overlord blurred as some men used their authority to strengthen their own hand. A Jito, once content with his fixed share and his policing role on an estate, might press into disputes between cultivators and absentee proprietors with a firmer thumb on the scale. An estate's sacred exemptions, that old fabric of privileges, woven around temples and aristocratic houses, frayed where it met the new reality of men with soldiers behind them. Meanwhile, provincial military governors, originally tasked with discipline and levy coordination, learned to broker power more broadly, not only overseeing order, but deciding who could keep which benefit and on what condition. These are not big words, but you feel their weight. Oversight softens into rule, custom hardens into claim. Kamakura still worked. Councils met. Judgments were issued with reference to precedents and recorded neatly. Oaths took place before shrines. Audits followed the paths of rivers and roads. Yet every action touched lightly by fatigue. It is not easy to sustain a state whose model is service for confirmation, when the confirmations you can offer feel smaller each year. To keep men steady, the Regency leaned on other reserves, honor, ritual, and the moral prestige of the office itself. Rituals multiplied around appointments and audiences, creating a kind of civic religion of duty. Banners were presented with solemn words, tokens bestowed with gravity, men reminded of their place in the chain that secured the country. For a while, as always, dignity was enough to strengthen duty. But dignity cannot be eaten, and when a family's accounts ran red, 3 springs in a row, patience waned. In this strained quiet, the court in the old capital stirred. The imperial institution, so long overshadowed, had its own arithmetic of longing and memory. Smoothed by ritual and trained in endurance, it nevertheless carried a clear picture of what once had been and what might be restored. The effort that followed was not a riot but an assertion of authority in the language of old forms, proclamations of sovereign power, the bestowal of titles without deference to Kamakura's recommendations, the call to those who felt themselves slighted by the Regency's careful rationing of favor. You learn again that legitimacy is not singular. It is a braid of habit, utility, and reverence, and if any strand can be made brighter in bad light, men will look toward it. The countryside did what it always does, it calculated. Some warriors, especially those whose patience had been worn thin by debts and postponed favors, answered the court's beckoning. Others, tied by appointment and oath to Kamakura, stayed firm. Many watched and waited, trying to keep fields producing while the sky of authority clouded. The conflict that followed was no simple duel. It took the form of a series of marches and sieges, proclamations and petitions, and decisions made in the narrow rooms where officials bend together over documents. Towns took sides, monasteries assessed risk, laid down conditions for neutrality or support, and prepared to receive the wounded and to certify deaths when the time came. Along the roads, relay stations sent duplicated messages in both directions, an unintentional honesty about the divided heart of the land. Certain names rise in your mind, not because the story needs heroes, but because they mark the places where strategy met terrain, and determination met patience. There is the image of a fortress on a mountain stronghold held by men who had studied supply lines more than sword dances, making every sack of rice count, every rope ladder last, as they refused to abandon principles that to them gave meaning to the country. There is the image of a determined march along the coastline toward Kamakura, not as a grand parade, but as a series of practical crossings, bridges taken intact, ferries seized, shallow waters measured by men with poles, each moment planned, around tides and roadbeds. Kamakura prepared. It had outward roads rebuilt and inner defenses checked. It issued pronouncements condemning disloyalty and reminding those who hesitated that their confirmations, their lines in the registers, their claims to the income of particular paddies all depended on a loyalty that, until now, had kept life balanced. The letters are respectful and firm, the tone one of paternal discipline. Yet discipline could not do what only confidence can do, turn men into stone when the wind shifts. The Regency's reliance on committees and procedures had built a flexible machine. Flexibility is a virtue in administration. In crisis, it can look like looseness. The end, when it came, did not take the form of a dramatic breach of walls or a day-long slaughter that legends adore. It took the form of coordinated pressure applied along the seams of a system, of men who knew the landscape of Kamakura's approaches better than most, who used tide and mud to surprise those who thought a ridge impassable if the sea was high. The defenders fought. Do not imagine them collapsing from indifference, but their strength had been measured and budgeted for a kind of conflict that rewarded standing in place and doing the necessary thing for longer than an opponent could endure. Against an adversary willing to rearrange the grammar of the field, to insist that a measured oath might be annulled by a deeper claim of right, the habits of competence lost the advantage they should have had. In the city, after the fall, the smell of ash and ink mingled. Office shelves empty, but not all their contents are destroyed. Some bundles of documents end up carried away by men thinking ahead to the legal fights that will follow any new order. Others are trampled in muddy alleys, seals broken, strings snapped. A generation of scribes loses a job. Another generation learns a new handwriting. Families who had lived by Kamakura's procedures raced to confirm their positions under a different music, some through old connections to the court, others through quick displays of utility to the new commanders, who announced themselves with careful proclamations. The state is not a palace or a person, it is a method and a memory. Methods change, memory endures as long as enough people care to keep certain stories straight. You will be tempted to turn your head away from the wreckage and look for a clean transition. That is understandable, but the truth is better served if you dwell in the tedium of what comes next. A restoration is proclaimed in the language of renewal, and for a brief period the air fills again with courtly terms and the echo of rights that had not gone away, only quieted. Offices are reassigned. The principle of merit is praised in tones that suggest that merit has a particular shape, recognizable to those who know poetry and possess old seals. Some warriors feel honored to be folded into ancient forms. Others feel the hollowness in ceremonies that cannot pay their men or ease their ledgers. Within months, the problem that had broken Kamakura's back appears in the new order's ledger. 2. The expected returns do not match the required grants. A recalibration is attempted in different words and with different silhouettes in the front row. Arithmetic cares little for silhouettes. In the provinces, the most durable units remain households and villages. You follow a headman as he attends to matters he has seen under different flags: irrigation ditches clogged by a late summer storm, disputes over access to a well, a cow gone missing, and the owner furious enough to accuse a neighbor who is too tired to protest loudly. The headman does what his father did, and his son will do. He consults the people who actually know, settles the matter with reference to custom, records the decision in a way that someone can read 5 years from now, and goes home in the evening to check the locks on the chest that holds the community's papers. Above his head, banners change, men make oaths to different names, and the direction to which he bows at festivals shifts. The rice still needs harvesting at the right hour, the paperwork still needs drying in a careful place when the weather turns damp. If you listen in the houses of warriors who survived the turn, you hear a pragmatic melancholy. They speak of men who broke their oaths and men who kept them at a cost. They speak of the folly of expecting mathematics to be moved by ceremony. They speak of the relief of serving institutions that at least understand that lists must be accurate and deadlines real. Some are reappointed to offices under new masters. Some retire to smaller holdings, their sons looking to the horizons, eyes trained by years of oaths and audits to see where steadiness might still be needed next. The culture that valued practical reliability does not vanish, it migrates. Meditative gains of Kamakura's years of careful administration do not simply evaporate into the mist of a changing dynasty. They settle into habits everywhere, the expectation that a dispute should be decided based on known rules, the comfort that a written confirmation with the right seal will be honored by the next man as well as this one. The idea that order is not the property of a single court or camp, but of a set of procedures that keep people fed and roads passable. In the centuries to come, those habits will be abused and restored, forgotten and reinvented, but free of the names by which you learned them here. This is the secret of boring history. It transmits through form more than through face. You end this first story in a room that now belongs to another administration, looking at shelves where new scrolls are settling and old ones are pushed too. The back in a crowded dignity, the brush is the same, the ink the same, the characters familiar, the men are different. You wonder what it takes for a country to hold on to the best of what its previous order learned without smuggling in the exhaustion that undid it. You ask yourself whether resilience resides in a person or a practice, in a title or in the quiet. Ability to count what must be counted and to forgive what must be forgiven. When the next government promises to balance sword and seal more gracefully than the last, you consider what you have just watched and ask, with the calm of someone used to ledger lines and ration schedules, when the next long strain comes, as it always does, will the new methods prove more generous to those who serve, or will the arithmetic of duty and reward pull tight until it snaps again? You step into Kyoto at a time when authority is being rewoven thread by thread, and the sound you hear first is not the clatter of armor or the ring of bells, but the murmur of clerks reading petitions. In a house near the Kamo River, the Nube, military rulers set their desks where courtiers used to trade verses, and the air smells of ink and lacquer. You watch men who once carried banners now carry bundles of paper because their swords have delivered a victory that must be made into normal days. The Ashikaga ascendancy begins not with a stable plan but with a series of solutions to immediate crises, each solution documented, sealed and filed. The city is a palimpsest of old and new, the palace precinct retaining its forms while a different center of decision-making grows in the Muromachi district, where soldiers learn to be officials by repeated use. At first, what matters is legitimacy, a word that feels like ceremony but operates like bread. An emperor, deposed and restored and opposed, sets the stage for a split that will linger beyond any one man's life. Two courts, each claiming the right to bestow names and titles, ask the country to recognize the same old language printed on different banners. You, who have grown used to the idea that legitimacy rests on whether fields are harvested and disputes settled, Watch as a deeper argument in the realm of symbols ripples outward into real consequences. Which appointment letter counts? Whose seal overrides another's? Which calendar of observances you follow when ordering the year? The Ashikaga shoguns, beginning with a man who learned to survive by bending, try to hold both swords and seals, accepting the court's blessing while building a government whose heart is less gold and more paper. From the start, the new bakufu relies on old institutional shapes adapted for new purposes. It sets up offices with names that would be familiar to earlier generations, places to hear cases, to discipline soldiers, to manage estate affairs, but it adjusts what those offices do to suit a country where warriors now mediate most disputes and collect much of the rice. Provincial governance turns on the figure of the shugo, the military governor, whose authority expands bit by practical bit beyond policing to include adjudication, tax collection, and the right to name lower officials. You see the line between a steward's local responsibilities and a governor's regional reach become thicker and more consequential. A system that once relied on the delicate balance of estate privileges and imperial edicts tilts toward a logic in which those who can keep roads safe and granaries orderly deserve, and thus receive, wider powers. The dual courts make daily life confusing but not impossible. In villages, the seasons still drive labor, and people measure time by the tasks that repeat without asking permission. Yet each significant transition, a marriage, an inheritance, a dispute over a boundary marker, loosened by flood, now carries an extra layer of uncertainty. Which authority will confirm a headman's election? Which paper, when presented to a man with a sword, will cause him to step back rather than press forward? The answer varies by place, by relationships, by which shogunal deputy or imperial envoy arrives first. You learn to read faces as much as seals. If you are a village scribe, your work multiplies. You make copies for both sides. You keep more careful lists of who attended which ritual. You compare the colors of ink to determine which document was written later. And you keep a hidden drawer where disputable records can rest until the wind shifts. Money becomes a more visible part of governance during these years. Copper coins brought in via trade across the sea or minted in fits and starts pass from hand to hand in market districts that thicken along the main roads and near temple gates. You can feel the way shopkeepers memorize the weight and ring of coins, rejecting those that sound dull or that bear designs not recognized in local practice. Markets attract guilds that regulate entry, press for privileges, and negotiate tax rates, and these guilds in turn become negotiating partners for officials who need predictable revenue more than they desire strict control. If you want to see where politics and daily life meet, you stand at a crossroads market at dusk, listening to a tax collector's steady voice reminding stallholders that the levy funds the patrol that makes it safe for women to return home after the stalls close. Here, in the middle of commerce, the shogunate's presence is both abstract and practical. Kyoto remains a theater for the nation. The court persists, gracious and punctilious, its ceremonies an old rhythm that gives meaning beyond immediate need. The shogun's residence in the Muromachi district grows into a semi-palatial complex, ringed by the households of senior retainers who measure status by distance to the center and by the number of visits to the audience hall. You walk through these neighborhoods and see the layers, a lacquered box being carried to a poetry meeting, a training yard where boys learn to hold bows, a back room where a woman writes out the household accounts and marks which debts can be pressed and which should be allowed to linger. The city's streets alternate between processions and mud, the high and the low constantly in view. Even its festivals bear the imprint of new conditions. A parade can double as an occasion for announcing a tax remission, and a temple restoration can become a moment to recalibrate the rights attached to its lands. In the provinces, the ordinary mechanics of rule take on new shapes. The shugo, originally appointed to keep order and summon men for levy, begins to accept and then expect a portion of estate revenues in exchange for protection and recognition. Contracts formalize arrangements where a local landholder agrees to pay a set share for a fixed term in return for the shugo's protection against rivals and predators. The language is unromantic: quantities, deadlines, penalties. You watch men who once had only swords become men with ledgers. Some do the new work well, understanding that restraint and respect for custom keep the flow steady. Others overreach, confusing temporary permission with permanent right, and in their overreach you glimpse the seeds of future wars planted carefully in the margins of agreements that everyone signs because the alternative is worse for now. Religious institutions adjust with practiced grace. Zen monasteries, in particular, become centers where the new elite find a language for discipline and emptiness that suits a life of attention and strain. Monks who spend mornings in meditation spend afternoons helping negotiate settlements, leveraging a reputation for disinterest into the power to make men of ambition sit still long enough to find an arrangement both can accept. The gardens they build, carefully raked gravel, stones placed with intent, serve as both spiritual exercises and trainings in statecraft. You stand at the edge of one garden and see a diagram of stability in a world of flux. Meanwhile, temples, with estate holdings, continue their older roles as employers, storehouse keepers, and courts of first resort for the communities that cluster around them. The military rulers confirm temple privileges with one hand even as they pair them with the other, because cooperation is more valuable than domination. Trade with the continent continues like a tide that citizens watch without being able to name its larger currents. Tall ships dock, crewed by men with different vowels, and officials step aboard to count bundles and mark their cords. Government-sanctioned voyages become a way to draw coin and goods into a state apparatus that is never rich enough to satisfy its promises. The paperwork around these voyages proliferates because each safe departure and return is a source of patronage. In a country of divided authority, controlling access to sanctioned trade is a way to bind men together. You note how a license to take a ship abroad can be converted into a loan, a marriage, an appointment. Nothing is wasted in this economy of favors. Even the word used for permission to go sees daily use in metaphor. A poet writes about needing a license to cross the season's threshold, and everyone smiles because they know the joke lands in their lives too. The theme that keeps returning is governance through negotiated routines. A system that lacks the unchallengeable dominance of a singular court sustains itself by turning disagreement into procedure. The Ashikaga Shogunate does not command as much as it convenes, and the convening is relentless. Councils are called, lists made, cases triaged. You sit in a provincial capital and watch a day's docket, a boundary dispute postponed until the floodwaters recede, a farmer's complaint against a local retainer heard and decided in his favor with careful instructions about how the decision will be enforced without shaming anyone. A simmering feud between two junior vassals diffused with an exchange of hostages and a promise to review appointments in 6 months. These are small settlements, and none will be remembered with a great name, but they are the threads that keep the tapestry from falling to pieces while larger forces tug. Not everything can be settled by convening. Disorder surfaces in ways that committees cannot preempt. Bands of armed men take advantage of weak spots to collect their own tolls on bridges or to force villages to loan grain. When the central authority is strong enough, it moves quickly to crush such ventures. When it is distracted, it offers deals incorporating difficult men into the official structure in exchange for quiet. The moral calculus is never clean, and The memory of who was bought and who was punished becomes part of local identity, retold as caution or complaint. You learn that one of the enduring costs of ruling in this way is a long trail of resentments, blunted but not erased, that later leaders will inherit with the ledgers and the weapons. Time in Kyoto feels like a rhythm of rebuilding. Fires, accidental or not, sweep through neighborhoods. Floods change the shape of familiar roads. A palace is moved, reconstructed, or reimagined. The shogunal court builds itself into a center of taste as much as power. Patronage of theater and painting gives the city a new style. A preference for restraint and refinement becomes a language that allows men hardened by negotiation to soften at the edges without appearing weak. You attend a performance and notice that the audience watches with a discipline that matches the performer's mask. The people of order enjoy a story whose meaning is precise, whose gestures have been practiced, until spontaneity has been replaced with something sturdier. Ritual. If you lean over a map and trace lines from Kyoto to the provinces, you see not a hierarchy but a web. Information moves along roads and river routes, carried by messengers who know where to stop for fresh horses and which villages will give them a bowl of millet because the tax covers it. Orders travel outward, rice and coin flow inward. What tool holds the web together is not fear or love alone, but the regular correspondence of needs and deliveries. A governor who sends soldiers when bandits are bold expects deference when he asks for timber to repair a guardhouse. A temple that mediates. A compromise expects its lands to be taxed as agreed and no more. The Ashikaga Shogunate lives in the spaces of mutual expectation. It is impressive in its way how long this can work and how many lives are quietly made possible by men who learned, after failure and embarrassment, to be consistent. Yet even as you admire the competence, you count the seams. The dual courts still exist, their paperwork and ceremonies overlapping like double-exposed images, charming in art and dangerous in life. Loyalists to the old ideal and pragmatists of the new order trade insults in private and courtesy in public. In times of plenty, the system flexes and holds. In times of stress, it creaks audibly, and everyone listens for whether the sound will resolve into silence or shattering. You look at a storehouse with its carefully arranged sacks and think of how quickly one flood or one bad harvest or one ambitious man's impatience can empty it, despite all the care. You leave this section with a question that feels less like doubt than like appropriate caution. When the next wave of pressure rolls over the country through famine, factional pride, or a fire that burns longer than usual, will these well-practiced procedures knit the tear in the fabric, or will the tear widen into a rent no clerk can stitch shut? You look outward from Kyoto along roads that have acquired names, markers, and obligations. Each checkpoint has a roster. Each roster has a lineage of who owes guard duty on which day. The Shugo's authority has ripened into a kind of provincial grammar in which subjects, verbs, and objects are the same every season. A village owes rice to a storehouse pays soldiers, soldiers keep the road brings merchants, the merchants pay fees, the fees fund the court. It is not beautiful, but it passes, and in the passing you notice an elegance born of necessity. Over time, the governors have claimed more words in the sentence: the right to approve transfers of land rights, the authority to reassign certain functions from a negligent steward to a more dependable one, the power to suspend a privilege when public order requires it. Each expansion is justified by a story about disorder avoided. Contracts frame these expansions often as temporary measures that become custom. A landholder agrees to pay the Shugo's office a fixed share for the guarantee of protection and adjudication. A market guild receives the right to regulate entry and prices in exchange for a settled levy. The interlocking promises produce predictability, and predictability produces a kind of moral peace that lets daily life proceed. You visit a town near a river crossing and stand as the sun slants beside a stall where a woman sells oil. She knows how many jars she must sell to cover her fee and to pay her helper. She knows which official to greet with a polite bow when he passes. The official knows he cannot overreach because word will carry and the guild will complain, but the high governor, who prefers steady revenue to sudden abundance followed by scarcity. If politics is the human management of fear and appetite, this is politics working as intended. In Kyoto, neighborhood life becomes a form of self-government underwatch. Residents in certain wards organize to keep streets clean, to repair bridges, to prevent fires, and to make sure festival routes remain passable. The shogunate encourages this because self-organized order is cheaper than imposed order. You listen to a meeting of householders debating how much timber should be held in common for emergency repairs. The numbers are boring until you realize the conversation will determine whether a street survives the next disaster intact or scatters into private solutions. The city learns to balance central commands with local initiative, and in that balance, you hear the hum of a complex polity that has no single speaking voice. Zen monasteries of the 5 mountains continue to serve as schools for administrators. Young men sent to study there learn not only to contemplate, but to calculate the cost of a roof repair, the pace at which ink supplies must be reordered, the etiquette of letters that avoid offense while pressing a point. Monks correspond with provincial governors about tax rates and boundary clarifications, and some become traveling mediators whose presence in a conflict signals that compromise is possible. They also teach verse and taste, and this combination of aesthetics and administration creates a style of leadership that values restraint and form. You might think a garden is only a garden until you watch a governor use its pathways to control a conversation, leading a difficult subordinate past stones placed to calm, across gravel raked to quiet the mind, and into a space where a decision can be made without residue of humiliation. Trade with the continent is regularized into a system of licensed voyages, a mechanism that turns the uncertain ocean into a book of accounts. The lists of permitted ships, their cargoes, and their returns are carefully maintained, and the connection between a piece of paper in Kyoto and a hold full of copper or silk several months later is treated as a marvel and as proof that the shogunate's reach is real. Pirates, a category that covers a spectrum from independent seafarers to subsidized raiders, complicate the picture. Suppression campaigns alternate with incorporations. A notorious pirate can become an official with a seal after the right negotiation. You are reminded, as always, that labels serve order more than they describe essence. A man is what the state can make of him in the service of the routes staying open. Debt, a subject you have seen before, presses inward from the countryside. Merchants extend credit to households that must meet obligations before harvest. Temples lend from their reserves. Private lenders emerge with terms that range from reasonable to predatory. Periodically, pressure builds into a wave of petitions demanding cancellation of debts and the nullification of sales made under duress. Authorities respond with proclamations that soothe for a season, restoring a delicate equilibrium between promise and capacity. You feel the relief of families released from the immediate noose, and you understand the worry of lenders whose willingness to extend credit next year depends on a belief that rules will be applied with some consistency. The state stands astride this tension, invoking compassion and public order in the same breath. Its officials understand that stability is sometimes built on amnesia, carefully decreed. Cultural life continues to be a lever. Patronage of theatre, poetry, and tea practices is not only taste, but policy. Gatherings where poems are judged and chalices pass from hand to hand double as occasions for binding people together with shared talk and small obligations. A shogun can signal favor by encouraging a performance, and a faction can telegraph unity by attending in full. The content of the art, often restrained, favoring the subtle over the flashy, fits a governing class that has learned the hard way that excess invites challenge. You watch a performance where the actor's mask does not move, but your understanding does. It is graceful to change your mind without moving your face. It is how a city survives when eyes are always upon it. In provinces where estate structures remain relatively intact, the Shugo's officers work alongside stewards and temple representatives in a layered administration that must coordinate without erasing differences. You attend a boundary inspection where all parties bring old documents to the field, stones are exposed, distances paced, memories compared. The conversation turns on the order in which evidence counts. A living witness of a certain age may outrank a document with a broken seal. A document that has been recopied by a trusted scribe last winter may outrank a faded original found in a warehouse with mouse droppings on it. The ritual of decision-making draws legitimacy from showing that no voice was excluded, even when the final settlement satisfies no one entirely. This is how a society chooses to be bored in order to avoid blood. Kyoto's markets expand under the eyes of officials who prefer to steer rather than to suppress. Guilds receive monopoly rights in certain goods. In return, they provide taxes promptly and enforce quality among their members. People complain, as people always do, about the power of guilds to exclude and to collude, but they also appreciate that a promise has a place to go for redress when a purchase goes sour. You walk through an evening market where paper lanterns turn smoke into amber, and you pick up the rhythm of bargaining, firm, polite, rarely shouting. In a city that has seen too much shouting, the careful modulations of trade are a kind of social training in calmness. Not far from commerce, notice boards appear at intersections and near temples. They carry official proclamations, debt remissions, tax schedules, warnings about banditry, instructions about who must turn up for road repairs next week. People stop to read. Those who cannot read ask a neighbor to give the gist. The boards represent a modest triumph of the written state over the rumor mill. You may smile at their simplicity, boards with brushwork, strings for posting, a soldier nearby to keep order, but their effect is profound. They make the rules visible, and in a time when multiple authorities compete, visibility is a form of power that does not exhaust itself by being used. In the countryside, peasant leagues form when desperation outruns patience. Villages bind themselves together to refuse taxes they deem unfair, to push for debt relief, to force a negligent official to be replaced. These leagues are not revolutionary in the modern sense. They are conservative in that they demand the restoration of perceived norms. Yet their very existence reminds rulers that stability depends on more than military capacity. When a league gathers on a shrine's grounds, their banners bear slogans about justice and order that would not be out of place in a government proclamation. The overlap of language reveals the overlap of interests. Everyone wants rules that can be lived with. Underneath it all, a city learns to live with the possibility of fire. Night patrols mutter as they pass, peering at eaves and listening for the wrong crackle. Buckets line alleyways, wells are checked, roofs are repaired after even small storms. Because a loose tile can be a disaster's start. Firefighters develop their own codes, a way of whistling in the dark that becomes familiar to children who grow into adults who are half comforted by the sound. You find it fitting that so much of Muromashi governance is about prevention rather than cure, about having enough water in the right places rather than the strength to rebuild bigger after the flames. At the end of this long look at Shugo power and city routines, You feel the balance achieved through careful attention and shared habit. It is impressive, but it is also fragile the way a bowl is fragile even when it is sturdy. You turn the bowl in your hands and see hairline lines that might never widen if kept from sudden heat, and you ask a question that you know has no certain answer. How long can a system that borrows strength from temples, from guilds, from politely licensed voyages and carefully staged performances go on borrowing before a creditor calls in a debt of a kind no remission can satisfy? You step into Kyoto again, and the air is smoky. The war that breaks out begins with a succession dispute and ends with a city split by moats of ash. For years, factions associated with great houses face each other across barricades and burned out wards, and the fighting is intermittent enough that people try to maintain routines between skirmishes. Markets move, temples take in refugees, guilds organize defenses of streets, and messengers run through alleys with news that changes by the hour. The city that had learned to measure its peace in procedures experiences a different rhythm, a sequence of ceasefires, betrayals, and confused claims, shouted louder than they can be verified. The smell of lacquered screens burning mingles with the smell of boiled millet, and everyone remembers the old phrase that governance is the art of getting through the next day in such a way that the day after remains possible. In this exhaustion, something new ripens in the provinces. With the capital embroiled and the shogunate's authority spread thin, regional lords, some shugo, some men who rose by service or by seizing an opportunity, learned to concentrate power within their boundaries. They build alliances through marriage, contract, and hostage exchange. They recruit men not only for fighting but for administration. They take surveys of the land to know exactly what they can tax and how reliably. You recognize in their methods the lessons of earlier years. If you can count it, you can plan it. If you can plan it, you can promise. If you can promise, men will follow. They move their headquarters to positions that make sense for internal control rather than for proximity to Kyoto's intrigues, and they invest in storage and in the roads that link the high ground to the fields. Castles change shape. The hilltop, fort, once a convenient refuge, becomes a complex with terraces for residences, earthen walls reinforced by timber, and wells dug with attention to siege. Around these fortresses, towns begin to form, bringing together craftsmen, merchants, scribes, and families who trade security for new obligations. You walk through one of these towns and feel the energy of a place that is growing into a new kind of center. The Lord's office has lists of who owes what and when. The market has regulations posted about weights and measures. The temple has a schedule of festivals that doubles as a calendar for tax collection. A lord who can feed his followers during a siege can govern them in peace, and feeding requires numbers which become an ideology of their own. The estate system you saw earlier, with its nested privileges and exactions, phrase decisively. In some regions, temple lands remain important. In others, the new lords absorb rights and simplify obligations in the name of order. Simplification is often a euphemism for consolidation, and those who lose may not feel the new arrangements as justice. Yet they, too, benefit from clarity. A farmer who knows his rent and his corvée exactly can plan a year better than one who negotiates each month with 3 overlapping authorities. The officials who work under the new lords bring forward old forms, petitions, certificates, oaths, and they rationalize them, making the path from complaint to conclusion shorter and less ornate. Guilds in the cities find their privileges tested by the demands of war and by the rising power of places far from Kyoto. A merchant in a coastal town that has become a hub for moving goods through an inland sea grows wealthy and confident. He negotiates with local lords directly, bypassing older guild structures tied to the capital. A city of swords and oil and ships becomes a counterweight to the courtly city. Its people value punctuality and inventory over verse and procession. This is not a shift of virtue, but a shift of need. You listen to a negotiation between a lord's officer and a merchant about the price and delivery schedule for salt and rope. The conversation is as careful and as bounded as any poetry contest, and it binds two people into an alliance built of barrels and cordage. Peasant leagues change as well. They become more ambitious and more coherent, sometimes taking over a province's administration for a season, governed from a temple hall with rules posted for behavior and rates posted for tax. The very act of governing teaches them how difficult fairness is. Leaders who insisted on debt cancellation learned to ration relief. Men who shouted for justice must choose between two claimants when both stories sound true. The experience is sobering and instructive. Later, when a lord integrates such a league into his wider order, he inherits a group of people who know how to keep a pledge and how to bring a petition that can be answered. In this messy way, capacity for self-rule filters through the social fabric and remains there, even when banners shift. Kyoto itself develops a habit of self-organization that outlasts the war. Neighborhood associations strengthen, watch schedules become precise, lists of buckets and ladders are checked with a devotion that might look like superstition if it were not so practical. The city's leaders, the heads of wards, the guild elders, the temple abbots, learn to conduct joint councils that can authorize repairs, taxes, and security measures without waiting for approval from any absentee power. When the shogunate reasserts authority, it finds a city that can cooperate. When ordered again to provide men or money, the city now answers through structures it built for its own survival. You can see how governance is like water. It will flow into any container built well enough to hold it. After the long war, men with regional power have new habits. They think in terms of their domain's breadbasket, its weapons stockpiles, its human resources. They standardize arms and drill, but more importantly, they standardize the collection of rice, the maintenance of canals, the upkeep of roads. The samurai class settles into roles that are as much administrative as martial. In their households, the ledgers sit beside the armor stand, and women coordinate deliveries and audits with the same seriousness they give to arranging alliances through marriage. A house that balances its accounts can also hold a wall. You appreciate how the virtues that keep numbers from lying, patience, accuracy, calm, also keep swords sheathed longer. Religion adapts again. Temple fortresses that took on political roles during crisis negotiate their place in the regional orders rising around them. Some are reduced, some are incorporated, a few remain stubbornly independent. The landscape bears the marks of processions and sieges, but also of restored gates and rebuilt halls. Festivals return as soon as they can because they are not only joy, but a mechanism for collecting what the state needs: goods, attention, consent. Watching a procession after the war is like watching a negotiation made into dance. Every group's place in the line shows their place in the world. Every pause allows an adjustment, a tiny bargain made with the timing of the drums. The memory of the capital's burning becomes a lesson in redundancy. Outlying towns invest in storehouses, lords diversify suppliers, families keep small reserves of millet or beans in addition to rice. Redundancy feels expensive when nothing goes wrong. It feels like wisdom when something does. You study an inventory and see how the numbers reflect this lesson. The careful addition of a second source for rope, a second carpenter on retainer, a second well near the western gate. People learn to avoid the cheap bargain that is too dear. When the wind changes, plans made by regional lords begin to carry a different ambition, not just survival, but but the possibility of a new kind of national order grown from the provinces inward rather than imposed from the capital outward. Men who have mastered their own regions begin to measure each other, to test lines of supply that reach beyond traditional boundaries, to inquire about alliances that cross old loyalties. The language of legitimacy shifts again. It tilts toward whoever can guarantee that roads will remain passable and that taxes will stay predictable. You look across a map and see a handful of centers begin to glow brighter, their gravity increasing with each successful harvest, and each pledge honored on time. Kyoto, though wounded, remains a place where styles are ratified. A new generation of rulers must present themselves in a way that the city can recognize as civilized. The rituals remain useful, the tastes remain influential. You sit in a hall where a host pours thick tea and discusses a campaign in the same tone with which he discusses the glaze on a bowl. This is not hypocrisy, but the confidence of someone who has learned that control is never total, and that order is best signaled through self-control. The city becomes, again, an arbiter of tone, and tone is part of rule. Out of these long years of adaptation emerges a question that turns your gaze forward. If a country can be governed through negotiated routines when central power is weak, and if provinces can build miniature states that set their own standards of predictability, what happens when one leader arrives with both the appetite and the capacity to knit these routines into a single fabric? The skills that have sustained order, counting, scheduling, confirming, will be weapons in that leader's hands alongside spears. You end the Muromachi story listening to the dull, excellent sound of a granary door shutting properly after inspection, and you wonder, when the next shogun builds his order, will he remember that the quiet hinge is as important as the grand gate, and will he place his weight on the hinge first or the gate? You step into a century where maps quiver like sails and loyalty is measured in how far a man will carry rice. The country does not yet know the quiet cadence of Edo. It knows crossroads and musters, pledges spoken firmly in spring and tested before the harvest. You begin among men who are not yet famous, walking along rutted tracks with bundles on their backs and poles on their shoulders, moving the real currency of the age, grain that can be stacked, counted, and eaten. Warriors earn reputations not by speeches, but by getting supplies to the right place on the right day. In that practicality, you can already hear the future. The shogunate to come will be an empire of schedules. But for now, everything is provisional, including the borders of ambition. The first force you watch is the pressure to simplify. For generations, rights layered over rights, temple exemptions intertwined with aristocratic privileges, steward claims mixing with village customs, had created a landscape where law was more negotiation than declaration. Men rising from the provinces understand that this world must be made legible if it is to be governed from a single hand. The revolutionary language they adopt is disarmingly mundane: free markets in certain towns to break guild monopolies, the removal of road tolls that slow armies and commerce, a demand that local headmen present inventories that match their fields. The floodgates open gently at first. The more predictable a path, from field to post station to castle, the easier it becomes to promise steady pay, and steady pay attracts men who have grown tired of improvised glory. The castles you meet are not fairy tale keeps, but practical machinery. They sit where roads converge and rivers can be bridged, and they expand as much downward and outward as upward. Storehouses thicken along their outer rings. Water is captured in pools, scoured and repaired after every storm, and terraces are cut in the hillside so that carts can pass without slipping when the rains come. You stand inside 1 yard and watch. A clerk mark bundles with a brush each mark telling a story about where the rice came from and where it will go. The men who command here think in weights and travel times more than in charges and duels. They use gunpowder and patience alongside tax schedules. Their revolutions wear sandals. Merchants, too, learn that they live in an age where a road is a promise. They move between towns newly unshackled from the old guilds, and they discover that predictable protection from local warlords is worth a tax. The word travelling in their mouths is license, permission to sell this good in that place at a known levy, and it becomes a kind of paper armour. You listen to them in a roadside inn as they discuss who keeps his word, which lords, officers actually escort caravans when bandit rumours rise, and where to find pack horses that can be counted on to arrive with their loads intact. Their caution, their desire for routine, will nourish the system that later governs. But in this moment, their interests ally them with any leader who makes the world less arbitrary, because fewer surprises mean fewer ways to lose everything, to a fire, a flood, or a sudden declaration. A new language of numbers spreads. Men who plan campaigns ask for the number of roofs in a village because each roof means hands for conscription or backs to carry loads. They ask for the number of days a post station can keep fresh horses ready in summer heat, and how often a bridge on the main road has washed out in the past 10 years. A supply officer's maps are palimpsests of weather as much as of roads. His notes in the margins, when the ford is passable, which family can be relied upon to bake hardtack that does not crumble, are worth 1,000 slogans. You learn to admire this low genius of system building, the steady application of attention to detail that lets men imagine ruling a whole country by arranging carefully how bread reaches mouths and orders reach ears. Weaponry changes the tempo of administration. Handheld guns do not make a man a soldier by themselves. Logistics and training make him reliable. You watch drills in a field where the talk is not of valor, but of timing. A line must fire, step, and reload in a rhythm that leaves no gaps. Supplies of powder must be kept dry. Water must be brought to cool the barrels. The men assigned to carry the pieces must be fed on time, or their steps falter. The obsession with timing infects the wider order. It becomes normal to expect that a billet will be fulfilled at the exact hour posted, that a messenger's arrival can be predicted by the length of his stride, that a levy can be summoned on a cycle that matches the phases of the moon. The life to come in Edo will turn on clocks made of human habit. You watch those clocks being wound. Meanwhile, the lines between classes begin to sharpen under the pressure to make service dependable. A village cannot provide both militia and full-time laborers indefinitely. Choices are made. Some men become soldiers by profession. Others are urged politely at first, and then forcefully, back toward the fields with the promise that their peace will be purchased by the swords that they are now forbidden to carry. The separation, once convenient, grows ideological. It will have consequences. A society whose order rests on reliable rice deliveries needs farmers who are protected and officers who are content to be paid in rice. The bargain is written at first in letters sealed with urgency. It will later be carved into the expectations of generations. Land comes under a more relentless gaze than ever before. Surveys of fields are conducted with ropes, rods, and an eye for fairness that is practical more than philosophical. The goal is comprehension, to know what each plot can yield in a normal year, and to translate that into obligations that can be met even when times are lean. Local headmen, who once had flexibility to massage numbers for the sake of peace, now face inspectors who insist on uniform standards. You hear the sigh of accommodation. The new numbers may be harsh, but they stop the sudden swings that ruin men. Once the numbers stick, the administration can promise to leave villages alone so long as the expected grain arrives. Freedom to me too. Visitations becomes a reward, and it is one that people value, the right to be boring without being poor. The burden of ambition falls heavily on those who carry it for others. Foot soldiers, appointed for a season and then retained for years because they are trustworthy, find themselves wedged between the needs of a household and the needs of a warlord who promises to return them after the campaign. They become the human hinge on which two expectations turn. Payment in rice is steady, but it cannot season a marriage or plough a field by itself. You meet a man who calculates to the bowl how much his family will need if the campaign runs 2 months beyond the plan, and he chooses to borrow grain at moderate interest from a temple where the loan will not shame him. When he returns, he repays his debt by hauling timber for repairs after a storm. The ledger of his life shows the state's shape in small entries: rice received, labor rendered, interest forgiven during a bad year. The genius of unification is to make men like him feel that the ledger is manageable. Ceremony does not vanish, it shifts its center of gravity. A tea gathering in a commander's compound becomes part of the work of rule. Participants bring not only bowls but news: how the last convoy fared, which local steward can be trusted, which manager at the granary has a habit of overcharging and should be watched. Taste is elevated into a discipline because it exemplifies the restraint and focus that make administration work. The host arranges a space where attention is paid to essentials and excess is avoided. Those who attend are practicing for a future where their ability to restrain appetite will matter more than their capacity for fury. You watch a man turn a problem into a conversation about the right time to remove a kettle from the heat and realize that a code of control is being set in place. Religious houses continue to be more than prayer. Their storehouses serve as buffers between thin and fat years, their scribes as guarantors of contracts made where tempers run high, their abbots as mediators who can neutralize old feuds by promising to keep records secure. In a countryside, still twitchy with fear of sudden change, the sight of temple walls offers reassurance that some terms will survive. Leaders who seek to unify the country understand this and confirm temple privileges when doing so delivers cooperation in the lowlands and keeps the faith of men in the uplands who are cautious about news that arrives wrapped in ambition. It is not hypocrisy. It is the recognition that stability is a chain of institutions, some older than the current banners. On the roads, the skeleton of a national system shows itself. Relay stations receive care disproportionate to their glamour. Stables are kept clean, horses fed, fodder stocked with attention to the different needs of summer and winter. Inns are required to keep certain numbers of rooms ready for official messengers. Kitchens are inspected to ensure that provisions do not run short when a sudden convoy arrives at dusk. Bridges are repaired after each flood by people who know that a broken bridge is not only a local inconvenience but a national insult. The expectation that an order can move from one end of the land to the other within a known window is a novelty many do not fully appreciate until it fails. When it does not fail, the habit of obedience deepens. Internal trade flexes along these routes. Rice moves one way. Salt and cloth and iron move the other. Coin begins to travel more confidently alongside the old measures of value. The rhythms of market days line up with the rhythms of levy assembly points, and a subtle economy of scale begins to emerge. A pack-horse driver can plan a year better when he knows that a lord will call his men on a particular schedule. A farmer can decide whether to plant a slightly riskier variety of rice because he has heard that next spring the demand for additional grain will spike to fund a campaign. In this network of intentions, you see the kernel of peace. Time slots for ambition that are predictable enough to live around. Even human memory is drafted into service. Stories of betrayals and clever escapes are replaced, in camp talk, by stories of convoys that made it through a storm because the men stayed on schedule, or of a castle storehouse that did not leak even during the typhoon thanks to a new angle of thatching. The mundane details that once bored young men become badges of maturity. It is a cultural shift as much as a political one, the admiration for quiet competence over sudden brilliance. You feel its heat more than its light, but it warms the long nights and makes a future of counted things feel not only possible, but desirable. Yet in all of this method, a personal truth persists. Essential decisions still come down to relationships. A commander who has learned to be ruthless with numbers must still be generous with men. He must recognize when a retainer's request for a small allotment of rice hides a deeper anxiety about a family's future, and he must grant the allotment promptly to secure a loyalty that numbers alone cannot compel. He must keep his promises, not only about pay but about respect, because the men who enforce a levy in his name know exactly when they are being asked to bend a rule and when they are being asked to break faith. The art of unification is therefore not only weights and measures, but the deftness of never forcing a man to choose between self-respect and obedience more than is absolutely necessary. As more of the land comes under one hand's influence, redistributions of territory follow victory. The men who are found reliable are moved, sometimes far from home, to oversee crucial nodes in the growing network of roads, rivers, and towns. Such moves are not punishment, they are proof of trust, but they also sever old loyalties and force new identities. A retainer from the east finds himself responsible for a valley in the west. He brings his discipline and his worries, he learns the local weather and the local language of favor. The system bets that his need to justify his appointment will make him meticulous. Often it does. Standing at the edge of this busy, intentional landscape, you can almost feel the quiet that will follow, the long stillness of Edo's clockwork. But you also sense the limits in the very virtues that are being honed. A network designed for decisive leaders who demand schedules may strain when those leaders leave no successor with their combination of hunger and restraint. The habits being formed rely on a particular balance of fear and fairness. You are grateful for the roads, the granaries, the inspections, the policies that reward punctuality and punish sudden greed. Still, as you watch a convoy of rice roll out of a valley toward a castle that is now more machine than monument, a thought rises like a red thread in the weave. In a system so exquisitely tuned to human hands, what happens when the hand that set the tempo is gone and the next hand keeps a slightly different beat? You step closer to the apparatus of measurement and you find it humming. Ropes, rods, abachi, and folded papers with neatly written characters become the implements of rule. The ambition now is to see the whole country at once, not just as a map of roads and castles, but as a ledger of fields and mouths. Men move out in teams, accompanied by local headmen who know every bend in a canal and every patch of earth that fails in a dry summer. They mark corners with stones, pace distances with practiced feet, and write down yields in terms that tie directly to obligation. The surveys that result are less absolute than their authors hope. Fields change yearly in subtle ways, but they are consistent, and consistency is the real miracle. Once you can compare one valley to another in a standard unit, you can plan across mountains. Counting land produces more than numbers. It produces power. A domain can be rewarded or punished by recalculating its assigned yield. If a lord proves troublesome, his score can be trimmed by a reappraisal that finds his valley exhausted. If his loyalty is prized, his lands can be appraised generously. Such calibrations are not petty. They are the politics of keeping a map humane. The men who do the work understand that numbers sit on throats. They are careful, and they are sometimes also strategic. They learn which villages to favor with the benefit of the doubt and which to lean on, pressing them toward efficiency by the threat of inspection. People in the countryside learn in turn to see a survey team with a mixture of fear and relief. Fear because change is coming, relief because arbitrary exactions will be harder to disguise when numbers are pinned to posts. Alongside measurement comes disarmament, and the tone of governance shifts again. Swords are gathered from those who have no reason to wear them, and the act is justified with the language of peace. If you are not asked to fight, you will not be tempted to settle private quarrels by cutting. There is pageantry in the collection, piles of blades displayed, stories of treasure weapons brought in by reluctant hands, but the real work is the creation of separate tracks for lives. Farmers are told to farm, artisans to craft, and those who receive stipends to train and to govern. Mobility is not eliminated, but it is discouraged, and the effect is to let routines settle like silt in a calm river. You listen to men who complain in taverns that a nation without swords is a nation without honor. You also listen to women who whisper in courtyards that a village without swords is a village where boys live long enough to become husbands. Castle towns swell, and you learn to read them as weather vanes. Their growth depends less on towers than on storehouses and streets. The planners plot districts so that rice can move from the countryside through gates that can be closed if trouble arises. They set widths of roads to allow 2 carts to pass, even when flooded on one side. They concentrate crafts by street so that inspectors can find what they need quickly, and so that competition is direct and controlled. These choices are dull when described. They are electric in effect. A town that can move supplies like a chessboard moves pieces is a fortress when attacked, and a market when peace returns. People arrive with hopes that have shapes. A scribe hopes for steady work, copying orders. A cooper hopes to secure a contract for barrels. A woman who makes vinegar hopes to find a niche that the regulations will not destroy. In their lives, the state appears as a series of lanes and timetables. The great men who drive this system show a taste for things that reflect their values. They favor simple, strong ceramics over ornate, fussy ones. They favor gardens that reveal shape through restraint rather than through florid display. They talk about balance and heat control while discussing tea, even as they manage the heat of conflict in provinces. This is not affectation. It is a pedagogy for a class that must learn to resist its own impulses. You sit in a small tea room where a commander says little and pause precisely. His guests discuss a land redistribution in measured tones, their tempers cooling in the disciplined pacing of cups. The world they are building requires a religious reverence for timing and a suspicion of quick triumphs. The tea is strong and, when a remark comes too quickly, slightly bitter, a warning wrapped in flavor. The finance that sustains the new order is pre-modern but sophisticated. Rice is still king, but coin becomes its ambassador. Taxes are levied in grain and paid upward. Obligations are expressed in yields and barracks in bowls. Yet conversion grows common. Merchants hold rice on behalf of samurai who cannot store it themselves. They sell it in the market and credit accounts in coin that then smooths daily life. Rice brokers emerge as crucial intermediaries. They live at the edge of respectability, straddling the worlds of martial honor and market calculation, and they are indispensable. When a domain needs to pay its men in an off-season or fund repairs after a storm, a broker can turn a future harvest into present money. In exchange, he receives influence, a quiet seat in councils where policy is shaped by whoever can bridge the gap between intention and capacity. Communication becomes not merely faster, but more legitimate. Post stations keep ledgers of messages sent and received, their entries more than records. They are proofs that orders were issued or obligations met. A governor accused of negligence can produce a logbook with dates and names. A retainer can defend himself by showing that he arrived at a way station on time and proceeded as instructed. The culture of dismissal and rumor that fed earlier disorder is replaced gradually by a culture of documented sequence. You find it unglamorous, you also find it humane. A society that believes in paper is a society that allows a man to be saved. By fact, behind the harmonious surface, coercion remains. Land redistributions create winners who boast and losers who settle scores with slow-burning resentment. A family moved from their ancestral valley to a new assignment far away may accept the rationale that their talents are needed there. It also may not. Marriages are arranged not for romance but for aligning influence. Adoptions are engineered to give a childless lord an heir who will not unravel an administrative web. The same discretion that makes a clever placement also hides an injustice. Yet the framework of numbers and roots limits how wild these injustices can become. The roads carry inspectors, the surveys cap greed. The visible nature of movement keeps some abuses from growing fangs. Even disasters are assimilated into the system. A flood can flatten paddies and rot stores, but it also offers a test. Relief granaries are opened according to rules posted in advance. Loans are made with repayment schedules adjusted by flood depth. Groups are assigned to repair embankments with timetables that dovetail with the season's other demands. The officials who handle this work are not saints. Some skim, others try to make families beholden, but enough of them have been trained to think of their reputations as capital that such moments become advertisements for the regime's stability. People remember an official who arrived on time and stayed until the job was finished, and they repay him later with cooperation that cannot be coerced. A new habit of mind takes hold among those who govern to think of people as aggregates and flows. They speak of mouths to feed and hands to conscript, of barrels needed to last a siege for a certain number of days, of the speed at which messages must travel to coordinate movement across separate valleys. They compare their domains in columns. This is not the only way to think about human beings. It is not the most tender way, but it is a way that shrinks surprises. A society that has been bruised repeatedly by surprises will accept a little coldness in exchange for predictability. You hold that thought in your palm and feel its weight. A parallel habit forms among those who are governed. To plan. Farmers synchronize planting with levy schedules. Artisans time their production runs to gild. Inspections. Innkeepers keep separate ledgers for ordinary travelers and for official parties with fixed rates. People live by posted rules. This is not liberation, it is relief. In the monotony of routine, men find room to breathe. Their prayers at shrines become prayers for the continuance of a road more than for a windfall. A festival is less a break from the calendar than a fixed point around which to arrange effort. As the apparatus of counting matures, the unresolved problem tightens its shape. The system is attached to men. It runs through their bodies and their decisions. It depends on a leadership that accepts restraint as its ethic. It requires, too, followers who endure boring duties with the belief that they will be respected and fed. The brilliance of the system is that it holds so many moving parts steady. The flaw is that it holds them steady with bonds that are personal as much as structural. You stand before a storehouse that smells of dried straw and see beyond it a chain of obligations that reaches a lord's private chamber where he is old, where his son is young, and where his most talented retainer's loyalty wavers under the strain of a tight household ledger. If numbers have built this order, numbers can also crack it. And so you ask yourself a question as the inspectors fold their ropes and the scribes blow gently on fresh ink. When the men at the center weaken and the inevitable succession collides with the arithmetic of rice and reward, will the system's devotion to counting carry the country through? Or will the ledger that saved it prove to be the very weight that drags it under? You arrive at the tipping point with your senses tuned to routine. The roads you have watched for 2 sections carry more than grain now. They carry futures. Armies move in stages along paths measured in days, their advance and retreat plotted according to the needs of cartwheels and stomachs. The drama of the battlefield begins long before flags ripple in a misty field. It begins with who controls the depots, who guarantees passage through a mountain pass, who can count their vassals honestly when asked to assemble. It begins with whether a horseshoe smith has been paid and whether the smith's son is sick. The curvature of destiny is the curvature of supply lines. At the moment when alignments harden, you watch a man who has lived by patience tighten his schedule. He selects positions not for glory but for their ability to hold water and wheat. He calculates that a certain valley offers cleaner exits, that its farms can be commandeered without destroying the next year's yield, that its post stations can keep messages ahead of rumors. He issues orders that move like beads sliding on a string to secure a ferry, to reassure a village that their storehouses will be paid for what is taken, to fix a bridge with nails that will not rust in the first rain. A general who wins this way is easy to underestimate in stories later told by people who prefer heroes who yell, but you hear the quiet instruction to a retainer: do not fire until the clock says, not until the heart says. In that sentence lies 30 years of peace. The battlefield itself is a fog of constrained intentions. Men change sides, others choose to keep their promises in the teeth of temptation. But more decisive than any flaring act of treachery is the momentum of those prepared on time and drilled in habit. A unit that fires in sequence and processes orders without panic rolls across a flank that expected theatre. When it is over, the field is damp and crowded with things that never make it into poems: ledgers for casualty payments, lists for widows' allotments, orders for road repairs where wagons have torn up the verge. The victor's first acts are not speeches but assignments. This man to supervise redistribution here, that man to set up a provisional office there, those scribes to begin inventory. Peace enters as a clerk with a tired brush. The settlement that follows is a masterclass in using structure to replace charisma. Lands are redistributed with deliberate intent to break old concentrations of power. Allies are rewarded, but not so handsomely that they cannot be moved. Questionable men are placed far from their ancestral bases, their households entangled in new networks of obligation. The country's key arteries, roads that all must use, are pulled into a system of inspection and upkeep paid from above and enforced below. Checkpoints are standardized, post stations are put under common regulations. Inns are compelled to set aside rooms for official use. Rates are posted so that the handlers of messages are not delayed by quarrels at the desk. The roads receive names, circuit schedules, and the steady attention of men whose pride is not in prowess, but in punctuality. A political invention emerges from simple arithmetic. The practice of making lords spend part of their year away from home. The logic is boring and brilliant. If a man must travel with a retinue twice a year, he must maintain good roads. If he must pay for expensive stays in a capital, he cannot quietly hoard coin for rebellion. If his wife and children reside in the shadow of the central power when he is away, the bond is reinforced in private as well as public. None of this is proclaimed in the language of fear. It is wrapped in etiquette, in the exchange of gifts, in the fixed schedules of audiences where the right number of bows are paid at the right pace. But everyone sees the clean arithmetic beneath. The fact that people learn to love the pageantry, or at least to find dignity in it, does not make the lever less firm. Administration burrows into daily life with a rare combination of softness and steel. Towns are told how many firefighters they must field. Villages are told how often their bridges will be inspected. A census of people becomes a census of obligations. Neighborhood groups are formed with shared responsibility for behavior and for the reporting of absences. The moral life of a street takes on the shape of official paperwork. People complain about nosiness. These groups save lives when floods rise or when the price of rice spikes and tempers threaten to boil. Precisely because they are tedious, they are durable. You see mothers counting heads before night prayers, and you recognize statecraft in that domestic ritual. The state has moved into the hour where children sleep. The new capital grows into a workshop of rule. It smells of timber and lacquer, of drying rice and ink. Its waterways are used not only for pleasure cruises, but for barge deliveries timed according to celestial practicalities. The tide, the moon, the hour when a certain canal's wind predictably dies. A market of labor appears in plain view, scribes at stalls who can draft a petition properly for a fee, men with shoulders broad enough to carry loads all day on a schedule, brokers who claim they can secure a better rate for your domains. Rice if you entrust them with the paper. A class of professionals emerges whose loyalty is to regularity itself. They are not aristocrats, they are not soldiers. They are the custodians of the ways that make a city move predictably. Their pride is discreet and stubborn. Culture is conscripted elegantly. The theatre begins to absorb tales of duty fulfilled through boredom. Plays praise the man who waits without grumbling, the woman who manages a household account with precision, the official who arrives at a post station exactly when the bell demands. Tea continues to be an ethic disguised as a drink. Poetry finds in the study of seasonal changes a metaphor for governance, the right gesture at the right time so that a pattern holds. People learn to see beauty in order not because they are coerced, but because their days are full of evidence that disorder is cruel to ordinary life. The romance of unpredictability lingers in songs about wandering, but it is increasingly a thing to be experienced in the theatre rather than on the road. At the margins, the new order watches the sea. Licenses to trade are issued and counted. Outsiders are recorded by where they stay and how long. This is not xenophobia, it is appetite constrained by caution. The grain economy cannot be allowed to swing wildly because a handful of men bring in coin and temptation. Inspection becomes hospitality's older, more responsible sibling. The city's ports apply the lessons learned from rice to everything. Measure, record, and then permit. You can hear the sighs of the impatient. You can also see in the continued calm of markets the benefit of being a little slower than desire would prefer. Lords in the provinces rebuild their thinking along the lines the centre encourages. They cultivate fields to increase yields, not by exhortation, but by digging canals and rotating crops. They set their samurai to work, reading, writing, and overseeing rather than fighting, and they take pride in a cadre of men who can be trusted to conduct an audit without either cruelty or laxity. Castle towns refine their divisions by street and craft. Fairs are scheduled and adhered to because such scheduling makes prosperity possible for more people across more months. Men who in youth dreamed of conquest discover in middle age the satisfaction of repairing a bridge exactly on time and exactly on budget. Human nature does not change. The rewards change, and the ranking of virtues changes and men respond. Still in the corners, the temptations that destroyed earlier regimes gather like dust. Debt accumulates in merchant houses that now hold the paper lifelines of domains. Clever men test how far the posted rules can be bent in private. A winter arrives harder than expected, and the rice in storehouses moves too slowly because someone forgot to clear a canal of reeds. The new order survives these stumbles because it has built redundancy into routine. It encourages people to keep small reserves at home. It trains officials to consider the second supplier, the second route, the second well. A polity that has been taught to count can also be taught to keep a spare sum aside. That domestic prudence mirrors national prudence, and it binds rulers and ruled in a shared ethic. Today we will be a little dull, so that tomorrow we will not be desperate. You stand at last in a broad avenue of the capital, lined with mansions, whose gates are flanked by lanterns carved with the names of domains. The air holds the muffled sound of many schedules being kept at once, a meeting that will start when the shadow reaches the second tile, a barge that will leave when the bell sounds the hour of the bore, a clerk who will finish copying an order before dusk so that it can ride out with the morning horses. You breathe in and you taste the antidote to the centuries of improvisation you have walked through to reach this point. Yet as the day cools, you remember that even the best schedules are written on paper. You ask yourself, not with dread, but with the appropriate sobriety of a person who has seen much and wants to sleep, whether the order begun on these roads and written in these ledgers can last across generations when the external world shifts and the internal currents of ambition stir. When the outside knocks and the inside grows restless, will the blueprints of control hold, or will they become, all at once, the map of a fall? You open your eyes in a city that runs like a clock wound by rice. Edo is not the scent of a single palace, but the breath of thousands of kitchens timed to market bells and river tides. The roads that lead to it are arteries with names that people speak the way they speak months. The great highways marked by milestones and patrolled by men who know how far a traveler on foot can go in a day when the wind is favorable. Checkpoints sit where the land narrows and their records are less about suspicion than about rhythm. Passes are stamped, and the stamps are the heartbeat of a state that measures movement so that it can predict demand, fix prices, and keep panic at bay without putting a sword to every throat. The ritual that shapes the year for the ruling class is movement itself. Lords travel to the capital with retinues that are moving theatres of logistics. Horses chew at specific hours. Porters change at posts listed in ledgers. The servants who carry bedding and lacquered chests know where to pause for the official meal and where to stop early when rain kills the afternoon. The cost of such travel is not an accident. It is a planned drain that binds ambition to exhaustion and expense. Yet within that compulsion there is dignity. Retainers take pride in the crispness of their line as it enters a post town. Innkeepers take pride in the speed with which they can set hot water on the hearth and rice to steaming when the signallers clack their sticks. The country learns to see greatness in punctuality. Inside the capital, administration lives in the gravel scrunch, beneath sandals. Offices for police, for finance, for urban order are arranged in a web that keeps eyes on every district without turning life into a parade of terrors. People are grouped into communities with names and responsibilities. If a fire starts, a certain ladder must appear within a certain count. If a traveller collapses, a certain number of men must carry him to an official bench where the incident is recorded by a scribe who knows how to pose the same question to 5 witnesses without confusing them. You hear the gentle tyranny of procedure and understand why the city is so clean. Rules are posted where people actually read them. on the pillars of bathhouses, at the entrances to markets, beside the doors of shrines. Rice remains the unit of value that ties the top to the bottom. Samurai stipends are measured in grain even if they are paid in coin. Domain budgets are converted from harvest projections. Household fortunes rise and fall on the prices set at exchanges where paper stands in for grain that may still be swaying. Green in distant fields. Brokers thrive as translators between the rice of promise and the coin of now. They are an ambiguous class, admired and resented, courted and scolded. A wise domain treats them as partners in stability, agreeing on schedules for delivery, and gently forcing epidemics of speculation to die by releasing grain from storehouses at the right hour. The less wise rage against prices as if anger could dissolve a drought. The city is large enough to have many hearts. One beats where carpenters repair roofs after the seasonal rains, timing their work to the forecasted winds. Another beats where fishmongers unload at dawn, their exchanges framed by rules designed to keep knives away from quarrels. Another beats where teachers drill children in syllables that march like soldiers. Even entertainment obeys the disciplines of time. Theatres open and close on schedule because their audiences live by schedules. The actor's mask and the clerk's calm share a common ethic. Control yourself so the form can be sustained. You watch a performance that celebrates a clerk who refuses a bribe with such courtesy that the briber does not feel the loss of face, and you feel how deeply the city has woven ethics into its pleasures. The countryside is not neglected, it is the city's foundation. Domains replicate the capital's habits at a smaller scale. They keep careful records of births and deaths, they conduct surveys to update their yields, and they maintain canals and embankments like nerves and skin. In village assemblies, farmers talk with officials about ditch cleaning schedules, the way city folk talk about theatre repertory with an intimate sense of the season and the cost of being late. Disputes over water are adjudicated quickly because delay kills more than patience. Even justice has been persuaded to keep time. Temples and shrines continue as anchors. They preserve documents in closets that smell of cedar and incense. They act as banks for seed grain. They hold festivals that punctuate the year with joy as much as with obligation. Priests record marriages and keep an eye on movements that worry the authorities. There is an unspoken understanding that ritual is a form of governance. A procession through a district reassures as much as it pleases, telling people that the order that keeps baths hot and rice affordable also keeps the gods engaged. You may shudder at the thought of control through celebration, but if you walk the streets and watch faces, you will see relief mingled with devotion. Predictable joy is a balm. Travel, even for commoners, becomes a way of participating in the nation's shared beat. Pilgrimages are licensed and controlled, but also encouraged because they turn people into citizens of the roads. A family saves for years to send a son to a famous shrine. His return is a festival in miniatures, stories told, stamps in a booklet admired, souvenirs tucked into household altars. Without saying so, the state has created a benign obsession with permits and post stations, integrating ordinary desire into the machinery that keeps order without constant force. The police in towns along the highways deal as often with lost passes and questions about schedules as they do with theft. Currency policy is a quiet art in this long piece. Coins of different metals and shapes circulate. The exchange rates between them change by decree and by necessity. When harvests fail, the city feels it first in the price of noodles. When a flood ruins a domain's stores, brokers feel it in sudden reluctance to extend credit. The government moves like a cautious physician, sometimes opening granaries, sometimes minting new coinage with adjusted content, sometimes scolding markets publicly to buy patience while private arrangements catch up. You can tell how serious a moment is by how widely officials consult. The worst choices are those made without the simple relief of conversation. Education becomes the solvent that holds lives smooth. Schooling spreads among commoners. Reading and writing are valued because they allow the adult to read posted schedules and to understand their obligations without needing a mediator who might take a cut. Manuals appear for everything: how to grow a certain melon, how to prevent household fires, how to prepare for taxes without panic. The literacy of the streets is not full of poetry, though poetry remains. It is full of lists. It is a literacy of survival, clear and modest, and it becomes a pride that cannot be bought. Administrators, from the highest councillors to the lowest ward captains, develop an ethos that mixes paternalism with a pragmatic humility. They issue edicts that plead as much as they command. They favour language about harmony and thrift. They prefer gradual adjustment to sudden edict. And when sudden edict is required, they cloak it in the language of returning to the old ways. The rhetoric of return soothes change. People accept new rules more easily when told they are old rules remembered. This is not cynical. It is an insight into how memory can be a tool of governance as much as a comfort for the governed. The costs of such order accumulate slowly. Samurai families begin to feel the pinch of stipends that do not keep up with the city's tastes. Merchants begin to press the boundaries of regulations that keep their hands on every lever except the most visible ones. Farmers begin to resent taxes that rise as precision increases, because precise taxes sometimes prove to be heavier than vague ones. The system meets these pressures with reforms that carry a family likeness, exhortations to simplify, to economize, to remember the fundamentals. The reforms work when they reduce surprises. They fail when they demand virtues that hunger cannot provide. You sit in a kitchen where a mother waters rice to feed 5 when there is rice for 4, and you see the limits of slogans. You put your hand on a milestone on the great highway and feel it warmed by countless palms. It is a symbol of a state that has made itself felt in harmless ways. A stone with numbers carved sharply, a promise that the next station is not far, and that someone is responsible for the safety of the space between. You have learned to love such promises. Yet the stone cannot answer a question that is beginning to trouble even the calmest officials as they scan the horizon of rumor and trade. If a system is built to keep the known in order, what happens when the unknown appears at the gate, carrying winds from oceans and ideas with teeth? When the distant knocks with a rhythm the highways have not yet learned, will the stone's guarantee of distance be enough to keep the heart steady? You sit through a winter that bites harder than the last, and you learn how much of peace is the management of shortage. The city that runs like a clock must now run while hungry. The price of rice climbs in stalls where the sellers try to keep their hands gentle. The brokers' faces become unreadable. Officials scan lists with more urgency. In villages, meals are stretched with millet and roots. In towns, kitchens turn out soups thinner than custom, but thick with the resolve to avoid panic. The government opens granaries by formula, calculating how much relief will lower prices without encouraging hoarding. This is not a theory, it is a choreography of wagons and announcements, a rhythm of queues and stamped tickets. Reforms arrive wrapped in familiar language. A high official publishes a program that praises frugality and discipline, encourages the planting of hardy varieties, and promotes the repair of irrigation works that have been postponed during easier years. He adjusts the coinage, tweaks the exchange rates, and sends inspectors to discover where greed has disguised itself as necessity. Another official follows a decade later with similar instruments tuned to a different crisis. The names of these reforms change, their music does not. They are variations on a theme of restoring balance. Some succeed for a time in quieting prices and expectations. Others fail, and failure takes the form of a crowd storming a rice broker's shop to seize sacks they believe were withheld unjustly. The state replies by punishing ringleaders, restoring order, and rephrasing its pleas. Debt is the shadow that lengthens even when the sun returns. Samurai families borrow against their stipends. Domains borrow against their future harvests. Merchants borrow to expand and to survive, then lend to rulers when the ruler's need is more pressing than the law allows. The debt becomes a tangle that only clever forbearance can keep from strangling everyone. Periodic cancellations are proclaimed, always in narrowly defined categories, always with the voice of a state that knows it risks choking the credit that oils daily life. People respond by keeping more secrets in their accounts. The window into true condition narrows. A culture that relies on paperwork learns to cultivate second ledgers written in heads and whispered across counters at dusk. Nature does not consult schedules. A flood rips through an inland town. A fire eats 3 streets before the bucket brigades catch it. A blight bows fields in 2 provinces. Each event is contained, then restored, at significant cost to the budgets of households and domains. The labor of prevention is intensified, canals cleaned earlier, roofs repaired more aggressively, embankments raised during seasons when men would prefer to rest. The long peace turns into a long chore. People become very good at not collapsing. It is a modest heroism that generates no epics, but that should be honored by anyone who eats regularly while others kneel in fields with spades. An intellectual current runs under these practicalities. Scholars of foreign learning consider instruments and medicines alongside texts and diagrams of the body and the heavens. Some ideas find purchase because they help. Vaccination, treated cautiously at first, begins to appear in records as a practice that reduces sorrow. The men who study trade winds and the composition of coins become careful critics of the state's currency policies, and sometimes the state listens. The inclusion of such voices into the conversation is one of the era's quiet strengths. It enlarges competence without advertising confession. The system remains proud and paternal, but it is not impermeable. Discontent collects in pockets where expectations have outpaced means. In the capital of commerce, a man with a rank, but without, means rages inwardly at the opulence he cannot afford to imitate. In the countryside, a family registers a complaint about a tax share recalculated upward after a new survey, and they find that while the calculation is correct, it is unkind. The authorities fear not grievance, but organization. When unrest clears its throat, officials attempt to listen quickly. A remission here, a replaced administrator there, a new schedule for tax deliveries that spreads the pain. Sometimes this works, sometimes it is too slow, and windows break. A man of conviction rises in a city on the water and calls officials thieves and cowards. He sets fire to his own house to make a point about purity, then leads men to attack Dua, warehouses of those he believes have prospered by stealing from the mouths of labor. His insurrection is brief and doomed by the system's own competence. Patrols know their routes, fires are contained, records are clear enough to convict the guilty and to acquit those unjustly accused in the heat of fury. The rebellion's failure proves the system's strength and also reveals its brittleness. It cannot absorb men like him except by killing them or letting them shake its pillars. It chooses the killing, then redoubles its rituals, hoping that the sound of bells will drown the sound of a question. What does justice taste like when eaten cold? Domains experiment within the cage. Some diversify crops with real success, others sponsor new industries, paper, ceramics, sugar, creating incomes that take pressure off rice. A few cultivate their merchant houses into quasi-official partners, guaranteeing their credit in exchange for loyalty that, over time, looks like mutual dependence. The cleverest of these experiments are kept small enough to avoid attracting jealous regulation. The less clever are exposed and trimmed. The center tolerates deviation when it does not threaten schedules. It punishes it when it does. People learn the art of being innovative by increments. The highways, those old promises in stone and gravel, become more important than ever because in economic stress, travel replaces transformation. People move to find work, even as movement remains regulated. Permits are granted more liberally when a domain requires hands for a project. They are tightened when unrest flares along a route. Inns keep careful lists, checkpoints compare them. Men disguise themselves as pilgrims to slip past obligations that shame more than they support. The apparatus of surveillance is real, but it is also limited by the numbers involved. The state maintains order by following the math of human flows. Where more people pass, more watchers are paid. Where fewer pass, watches ease. The budget directs morality as surely as edict. In households, women carry much of the strain. They stretch money, they manage small stores of grain, they barter quietly to keep pride intact, and they help their children learn skills that might provide a living if the family's status slips. In their ledgers lies the truth of the state's health as clearly as in the public accounts. A mother who crosses out 3 entries for rice bought on credit in a row knows more about the resilience of the system than a minister counseling thrift in a well-lit hall. Her success at keeping the family upright becomes a component of national stability, so taken for granted that it barely receives thanks. The great lesson of this middle stretch is not that peace is easy, it is that peace is work. People learn to prefer boredom to drama because boredom keeps children alive. The ceremonies that sometimes irritate the eyes, processions and inspections, bows and seals, are binding agents in a culture that treats predictability as the highest common good. You, having inhaled the dust of these roads and the steam of these kitchens, are reluctant to sneer at such prudence. But if you are honest, you also feel the fatigue of a system that requires so much attention to so many mechanics that there is little energy left for surprise. And that feeling becomes a question, standing like a spare bucket by a door. When surprise finally comes, will the hands that have become so skilled at sweeping floors and keeping accounts be nimble enough to change the furniture, or will they keep sweeping as the ceiling begins to crack? You wake to the sound of unfamiliar bells. The ships that arrive on a coast far from the capital do not ask permission in the old language, and their demands do not fit into any schedule. They bring not only goods, but a currency of pressure, the insistence that the country change its clocks or be broken by those who keep different time. Officials ride in hurry that looks like panic to post stations that were built to move news without panic. The post stations perform as designed. Messages arrive and meetings convene at rates, a confound habit. Old men of calm talk late into the night, weighing humility and pride against calculations about powder and coin. The choice that emerges is not satisfying. No choice under such conditions would be. Ports open, limited at first, then less so. Treaties are written. The paper is as real as the gates it obliges to swing. The entry of the outside shifts the inside. Currency stutters. The old ratios between metals become a machine for siphoning wealth out of the country, and the solder that held the budgets together begins to crack. Prices jump like fish in a net. Merchants who lived on tight margins see opportunity. Samurai who lived on fixed stipends feel insulted by arithmetic. The government adjusts again and again, but each adjustment reveals another layer of strain. Men with knowledge of far off markets become more important. Men whose honor resides in immovability become more anxious. You listen to arguments that are exactly what they must be. One side saying that to adapt is to survive, the other that to stand is to remain oneself. Factions arise in a language that strains to remain respectful. The idea that loyalty to a person and loyalty to a principle might diverge enters official speech. Some argue that reverence for the throne requires curbing the authority that has, until now, kept the inner peace. Others argue that the habit of rule must not be broken because habit is what prevents the country from dissolving under foreign eyes. These debates race through inns along the great highways and through barracks in capital neighborhoods. The system's own roads carry the arguments that will wreck its certainty. You have to admire the honesty. A state that trusted its people to move now trusts them to discuss. Trust is used to dig up trust. Regional powers trained for 2 centuries to administer prove dangerously good at it. Domains with savvy leadership begin to buy weapons with modern lines and to teach their men new drills. They reorganize budgets with a shrewdness that shows the depth of their practice. Alliances form that do not fit on the old charts. The center responds with reforms of its own, trying to demonstrate a capacity for fresh impulse, shaving away some dignities that had grown stiff with age, inviting new men into old rooms. The gesture works in part. It cannot work entirely. For decades, the state sustained itself by persuading everyone to accept the chore. Now it asks everyone to accept a new chore. Fatigue sharpens resistance. Violence returns in precise shapes. Roads that once wore the passing of processions now wear the dust of columns, armed with weapons that breathe smoke differently. Battles are fought with the mutual courtesy of men who know their enemies' schedules because those schedules look like their own. The difference lies in purpose as much as in tool. One side fights to preserve a form of life that has fed children. For a long time, the other fights to reshape that form before it breaks under an outside pressure that will not wait. Families in towns along the routes move their valuables into temple closets and wait. The routineness of patience in crisis is the final gift of the old system to the new. In the capital of peace, offices that smelled of ink become offices that smell of burning oil. Records are packed, some are destroyed, others are rescued by men who know that a future government will judge them by whether they can produce a piece of paper that survived the moment. The knowledge that nothing is final is the most modern feeling in the room. It is also profoundly familiar to anyone who ever had to submit a petition twice because the first was lost. Continuity persists in what looks like its opposite. Even in revolt, someone manages the schedule for trash collection because plague does not take sides. The end, when it comes, is not a single sound. It is the gradual quieting of a set of rituals that have been replaced by other rituals. The lords stop traveling with their full retinues. The bells that called them to audiences are replaced by whistles that time machines. Samurai stipends are commuted into sums of money that evaporate in inflation. Men hang swords on walls as memories while learning to manage shops or offices. Brokers become bankers. Schoolmasters teach children to read new maps. The laws of marriage and inheritance are rewritten in panels of type and printed for sale. The forms of obedience change, but the habit of writing and posting them remains. A civilization does not forget how to read because authority has changed its handwriting. Looking back over the span of this long peace and its careful end, you see the achievements resting in small places. Bridges repaired, markets kept honest. Enough. Granaries stocked, festivals that kept despair from dominating. schools that turned reading into an ordinary skill, roads that taught men to be citizens of somewhere larger than a village. You also see the costs filed in drawers that rarely open, the stunted hopes of men bound by class to stipends that shrank, the quiet grief of families who could not keep up with the price of rice, the impatience of minds that wanted to experiment faster than their permits allowed. That both truths can sit together is the final mark of a culture that trusted records. It kept the receipts for its triumphs and its failures. The new order that follows will make use of the very tools the old order crafted. It will standardize more aggressively, measure with greater reach, count not only fields but factories, and build new roads that ignore old post stations. It will force change with more speed than the lords of the highways ever would have permitted. And it will rely, in its first unsteady years, on men and women who learn to show up on time for boring work, to keep ledgers that add, to repair broken things before they break further. The clockwork of Edo stops, the habit of winding does not. You close your eyes on a street where the scent of cooked rice remains as a kindness in a season of uncertainty, and you ask the same question that once hung above a storehouse door during a storm. When we open again tomorrow, will order still be a blessing, or will it be a memory that we must remake with different tools and the same courage?